There are some novels that just scream winter to me. Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World is one of those novels. It balances such cozy and wistful vibes with feelings of isolation and detachment. So, put your jumper on, grab yourself a hot drink, come curl by the fire and let's talk about Murakami. This is the long-awaited second video in my Japanese literature series, and as a lovely treat for you, in honour of my very first video on this channel, I'm going to include some shoddily shot footage of Sapporo, Hokkaido that I took in 2018. Don't say I never do anything nice for you. Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World is a story split into two separate parts. The first is the story of an unnamed narrator who works as a data processor in a kind of alternative cyberpunk influenced 1980s Tokyo. We join the narrative of him entering the employ of an eccentric scientist who specialises in sound manipulation and the collection of obscure animal skulls. The data processing that our narrator does is specialised, to say the least. When he receives something to encrypt, he kind of turns it into number form and then inputs it into his right brain, shuffles it in his head and outputs it from his left brain. This shuffling process is explained is incredibly difficult to crack as a code due to the jagged nature of the mapping out of the connection between the two halves of the brain. Our narrator is a calcutech, essentially what's presented as the good guy version of this career, or at least the one working for the government organisation known as the System. This is opposed to a semiotech who works for the factory, the kind of a criminal enterprise. In the other half of the novel, which kind of is every other chapter, we join another unnamed narrator who has recently arrived in a town at the end of the world. This town is surrounded by a giant wall and is inhabited by people who have literally lost their minds. It's a peaceful place, a place without conflict. The kicker for living there is that the narrator has to give up his shadow to the gatekeeper. The shadow is then put to work looking after the unicorns that live within the town's boundary. This narrator is given the role of dream reader. He takes old unicorn skulls and with the help of a librarian is able to read them. As a result of his job, his eyes gain a kind of high level of sensitivity and he's unable to venture out during the daytime. What becomes clear as the novel progresses is that these two different sides are more intertwined than they first appear. Our main character in the Hard-Boiled Wonderland is given a unicorn skull by the professor, which he then investigates into with the assistance of a librarian love interest he meets. She, it should be noted, has gastric dilation for some reason and is able to eat entire meals on a whim. Fair play, living the dream. After his house is, shall we say, renovated by two thugs claiming to be outside of the two different branches of Calcutex, our narrator starts to suspect that the professor might be hiding a few things. It transpires that he was a former high-ranking member of the System who was involved in creating new branches of encryption. He successfully achieved this with the narrator through the form of shuffling, creating a sort of replica of the narrator's internal mind palace. Now, the narrator knew that shuffling was a restricted practice. What he didn't know is that of all the different people who learned to shuffle and had implants put into their brains, he was the only one that survived. This was due to the vividness of the narrative that already existed in his head. The other kind of mind worlds were lacking coherence, they didn't make straightforward plots, whereas his did. The professor, however, tampered with the mechanical system at the start of the novel. The narrator finds out that in mere days his consciousness will switch and he will be trapped inside the end of the world scenario forever. For all intents and purposes, he would feel like this experience is eternal. In the end of the world story, the narrator finds out that his shadow is dying and that this is in fact a necessary part of the process of living in the town. Each of the characters would lose their shadow and then would lose their mind. This was siphoned off into the unicorns, the skulls of which the narrator then read. After bringing a map of the town to the shadow, the two form an escape plan together. However, the narrator has become increasingly convinced that he'll be able to find the lost mind of the librarian that lives in the town. In the end, the narrators of both stories make their decisions. The hard-boiled narrator decides to allow his mind to switch and kind of sits out on the dock in his car, awaiting the inevitable. Rather than leaving with his shadow, the other narrator decides to stay. He realises there may be no chance of success, but he feels like he has to try and help her. The shadow leaves the town, and the narrator walks slowly back towards it. For me, there's something deeply nostalgic about the way that Haruki Murakami writes, and it's a feeling that I've had ever since I first picked up one of his novels, Kafka on the Shore, in 2015. The way he wields themes such as loneliness and introspection alongside incredibly creative world building is nothing short of masterly, in my opinion. He's often kind of seen as a meme among literature fans, the perennial bridesmaid of the Nobel Prize, who's more interested in jazz and over-sexualizing his young female characters than he is in answering any of the questions that he ever poses in his novels. It's said it's not a Murakami novel if it doesn't have a well, a talking cat, a phone call from the beyond, or someone who is really into ears. In some senses then, it's not surprising that the novel that I've come back to the most by Murakami is the one that largely dispenses with these tropes. Yes, it's true that there is unnecessary space in the novel dedicated to the fetishization of the professor's granddaughter. But at least that can arguably be seen as an intentional choice to kind of mimic the themes of noir detective novels. Indeed, one of the things that's notable about Hardboiled Wonderland is the attention that Murakami gives to genre conventions. The novel's split into a detective story influenced by the works of Raymond Chandler and a kind of utopian or dystopian fantasy sci-fi novel. It is interesting to think about what this hard-boiled genre brings to Murakami's story. When he's discussed the genre previously, Murakami's referred to his interest in the detective as individualist. And he has a preoccupation in his works that you see him go back to again and again of the difficulties of being a loner in Japanese society. This is a theme that's been taken up in numerous Japanese novels, such as Convenience Store Woman and Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. Murakami's protagonist is a divorced man in his 30s who kind of has more interest in reading Stendhal novels than in making friends. Think of the detached way the narrator reacts to events in the narrative. When Big Boy and Junior destroy his house, his reaction is to kind of take out a beer and enjoy the show. This has been described by one critic as a masochistically tinged resignation, which is typical of the genre. Throughout the novel, he remains remarkably nonplussed, even when dealing with mythological creatures such as the Inklings, kind of kappa living in the depths of Tokyo's sewer system. Here it's worth noting that the novel clearly also has cyberpunk influences, along the lines of William Gibson's Neuromancer, though Murakami himself has rejected that comparison. Nonetheless, the entire story, it becomes clear, is reliant on increasingly advanced neuroscience and biotechnology. Contrastingly, the end of the world is a calm and enjoyable break from the intensity of the hard-boiled Wonderland. Here, depending on your point of view, the story is either utopia or dystopia. In contrast to the past tense hard-boiled section of the novel, this part of the novel is told in present tense. This narrative technique can be connected to the reveal later in the novel that the end of the world is essentially an endless present to the characters that are living in it. The language in this part of the novel is more poetic, and Hantke makes the point that this part of the novel uses language that's more aligned with the Japanese literary tradition, with novels such as Snow Country. A part of what I love about this novel the most is the world-building quality in the end of the world section. I love the pastoral nature of the town, with the kind of unicorns walking around, the games that he plays with the general, and the simple wonder of discovering old musical instruments that the inhabitants of the town had lost the ability to play, but still in their own way were able to find beautiful. Yeah, I just love it. It's one of my favourite components of any Murakami novel. A lot of the critical discussion surrounding the novel has referred to solipsism, or the view that the self is the only thing that can be known to actually exist. Now, we've already talked about the fact that Murakami is preoccupied with the theme of being a loner. However, many see the protagonist's choice at the end of the novel to kind of leave the rest of the world behind as indicative of a solipsistic point of view. He chooses to withdraw into a world in which the other humans, if they can be even called that, are entirely mindless. What I will say is the depiction of the characters in the end of the world is showing that Murakami is not presenting like a David Chalmers style zombies argument here. Like, clearly there is something tangible that is mind, and it's something that these characters are lacking. Nonetheless, the disassociation in his brain is clearly tied into the disassociation of the character with society in a societal sense. And the fact is, he chooses intentionally to go fully into this disassociative state. And yet, it's not quite as simple as that. The end of the world protagonist is not choosing to resign his mind. Instead, he lets his shadow leave. And what that means in the sense of the novel is that he will be exiled to the forest. He won't be able to go back to the town as his mind is not fully gone. The narrator's choice to enter this place rather than leave should not be seen as a resignation, but as a deliberate choice. An act of a character ready to accept responsibility for others in a way that he hasn't been able to do so far in his life. This is also true for the narrator of Hard Boiled as well. Yes, he is choosing death in one sense, but it's notable how freeing this is for him. He's almost happy in the end, not because he's dying, but because he's able to recognise the limited joy that he's been able to bring about in the lives of others, including the professor, his granddaughter, and the librarian. This recognition of the importance of others is not solipsism, but exactly the opposite. Overall, what I love about this story is how personal the stakes are. He takes two genres with their expectations about the way that the novel is going to go, and instead subverts that into a deeply personal story about two halves of one man coming to terms with the responsibility that they have towards the people in the world around them. Hardboiled Wonderland is not my favourite Murakami novel. It is my most read though. I find myself coming back to it for many reasons. The beautiful and cosy world building of the town, which I adore, and the mundane day or so when the narrator's already aware that he's going to die soon, and he just kind of spends the day fannying about, like hanging out in a laundromat and watching a film at a video store with the person behind the desk. But I think more than anything, it's the heart at the centre of this novel. The acknowledgement that detachment is not the way to live your life that keeps me coming back to it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, my second video in my series on Japanese literature. Let me know whether you enjoyed this video and whether you enjoy the style of kind of incorporating old footage that I have into these videos, or whether you find it distracting and want me to go back to just like straight up delivery to the camera. Subscribe as well while you're at it, why not? And let me know what you thought about the book. Just a side note before we finish. You may note in the novel that none of the characters have names. And you might, you know, be wondering, oh, is there some kind of specific meaning attached to this? The truth is, Murakami noted in his essay, Novelist as Profession, that part of the reason that he didn't give his characters names was embarrassment, but it wasn't up for him to be able to do that. I found that incredibly endearing. Like, oh, Murakami. They're fictional characters, mate. You can do what you want to them. That's just so cute and so deeply awkward, and I love it. I just thought I'd share that. All right. Bye.